But right now, from external to the CEO, a modern approach to Outlook mail spoofing, let's welcome Ben Wilson to the stage.
Thank you. So this is my talk from external to the CEO, focusing on mail spoofing within Outlook. So a brief little overview. Ooh, that is not great. That's good on the other one. I guess I'll roll with it for now. So I'll start by going through some basics for SMTP. Then I'll go through email protections, a bit of a journey for how I discovered these spoofing techniques. If we've got time, I'll go through some extra tricks, and then I'll wrap it up at the end. So to start off, about me. I hate doing about me slides. So in the spirit of spoofing and this presentation, I thought I'd get Silvio to do an about me slide for me. So I'm a security consultant at Tanto Security. I'm in my final year as a computer science student. I love physical security, and overall I'm a really great guy. But don't take my word for it, take Silvio's word for it. So, SMTP basics. What is SMTP? Well, a brief history. So SMTP was the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. It was first devised as RFC 821, and it's had many extensions since then. So you've got MIME, multi-purpose internet mail extensions, so RFC 2045, and then the kind of extended SMTP, and that was RFC 1869. But at its core concept, when it was devised, it was a way for a user and a receiver, or to have their own SMTP servers, where the user would send an email, would go through their server, pass through to the receiver's server, and then to the file system. So that's a very basic overview. What this more looks like in practice for the infrastructure is you've got your mail user agent down the bottom, and that will send an email via SMTP on ports 465 or 587, which some of you may have been familiar with. It'll go to the message submission agent, which once the message submission agent receives it, pass it to a series of mail transfer agents running on, passing those through on SMTP, but this time through port 25. And then finally, once it's reached the final transfer agent, it will go to the delivery agent, which will then pass it through to the receiver's mail user agent via the IMAP and POP protocols. So how do you kind of, I guess, send an email or interact with these SMTP servers? Well, you have to use what are called commands. So there's quite a few commands. These are just a list of some of the basic ones. So you always start off with your hello kind of identifier, which is basically saying to the server, this is who I am, this is where I'm sending from. Then you'll go into the mail from, which will be the sender's address, so your address that you'll be sending from. Then you'll specify your recipient in your recipient to. Then the data, that's the main content of the message. So you'll put in, that's where you put your like SMTP headers and your message body, which will be terminated by a full stop. And then finally you'll send the quit command to end the transaction, finish the email, and send it off. So in practice, this might look like the following. So we've got a one agent here. The sender, the name is Jane, and a receiver server. So you're sending and receiving server. So Jane will start off by executing that hello command. So hello gmail.com. Hello, my name is Jane. I'm sending an email from gmail.com, and my IP is 10.10.10.10. And then your receiving server will be, oh yeah, that's good, that's fine by me. I'm ready to receive your email. You'll have your mail from, so Jane will say, oh, my email is jane@gmail.com. Then that's no worries with that. Jane will say, hey, I want to send to John, so john@outlook.com. Receiving servers, yep, that's fine. And then Jane will pass her data in there. So that starts with your data command, and then anything following that data command will be interpreted as the message content. So you've got your, for example, some basic SMTP headers from, to, subject, and then your message body down there, you know, hello John. And again, once again, terminated with that full stop. And then the server will go, yep, that's fine. I'll queue that and I'll send it off when I'm ready. And so then Jane can then quit that transaction to end it, and you know, that will be closed. Now, when you actually send a message, it's broken into, I guess, two main components. You've got your SMTP envelope, which is basically those commands you saw earlier. So at the top in my little graphic here, you can see I've got hello gmail.com, mail from Jane, and recipient to John. So that's your envelope. And then you've got your actual message content, which is inside that data command. And that will be the SMTP headers. So here I've got from, to, and the subject. And then the actual message body. So I've just got hello John, and again that full stop at the bottom. It's a little bit small, but it's there, I promise. So message headers, or SMTP headers. So an important distinction between SMTP commands and SMTP headers is that those SMTP headers are not actually responsible for routing the email. That's the SMTP command job. So when you specify that recipient to, that will be who receives the message. And these kind of headers here are more for, I guess, display, you could say. So there's a couple of basic ones which I've got here. So you've got from, which will be the author of the message. Your to address, which is your address of your primary recipient. The subject being the topic of the message. Content type, so here there's a number of them. I've got just plain text. And the content transfer encoding scheme, which is, you know, if you wanted to encode your message. Here I've just, you know, quoted printable, which is essentially plain text, a little bit different. But now, one thing to note is with each of these headers, they have to be terminated with a carriage return and a new line character. So you'll see after the from header, you've got that carriage return new line, then the to header, carriage return new line. If you don't include those, they won't be interpreted as valid headers, and sometimes can mess up the whole content of your email and it won't send correctly, and nobody wants that. So quickly on the message body, so as I've said, you can have different content types, so you know, a number of them being text, multi-part message. So text comes in plain text, HTML. Your multi-part message is more for what a lot of common mail clients send now, where they want to send like a HTML and a plain text. So you can send two of them, and the mail client will interpret which one depending on if they have support for HTML content. And then you've got your message, which is not often used, but it's more, one example is if you attach like an EML, if you actually attach the email to another email, that will be sent with a message content type, where that email file will be included in the content. And then you've got some encoding schemes, so quoted printable, that's essentially plain text. It's got a little bit extra encoding, but pretty much plain text. Then base64, which is self-explanatory, and binary encoding if you wanted to do that as well. So now I'm just going to dive into some email protections. So essentially you've got two, I guess, categories. You've got generic ones, and then there's ones which are Microsoft specific, which is more what I'm going to look into. So for your generic protections, these are probably the most well-known. So you've got SPF, which is a list of IPs which are allowed to send from a domain. You've got DKIM, which is the digital signature to verify that an email, you know, is still the same, hasn't been altered. And then you've got DMARC, which is a really long, stupid acronym, if you ask me, but domain-based message authentication reporting and conformance. Which will basically check that the domain used in SPF and DMARC matches that one in the from header. And it has a number of policies you can configure. So if DMARC fails, you can apply the relevant policy on failure. So this is more what I'm going to be focusing on is Microsoft specific, and I've broken it up into three main categories, which are easiest to digest. So you've got your mail flow rules, you've got native external tagging, and then anti-phishing policies, which is a huge subtopic there. But I'll get into each one. So mail flow rules are essentially rules that are applied to messages whilst they're in transit. So it's got plenty of conditions, exceptions, and actions you can take on an email, and it's often used to implement external tagging. So this tagging can be in the form of the subject or the message body. And basically what happens is if the message is detected as outside the organization, it will apply the necessary tag. So in this example, I've got in the subject, and I've also got a follow-up example of what it might look like in the message body. Basically just warning users that, hey, this message wasn't from someone within your organization, so just be on the lookout for suspicious stuff. So then there's native external tagging, which is the newer, more modern way to do it. It's exclusive to Exchange Online, so any kind of on-prem infrastructures won't be able to configure this, but within Exchange Online you can. As I said, it's the new recommended way to identify external senders, the main reason being that it doesn't actually obstruct the message or alter the message. So it basically inserts its own little, warning outside the message. So, you can't, the idea is that you can't alter it. So there's this little warning here saying, okay, Jane Smith's from outside my organization. And then you get the little external tag there in the message as well in the preview pane. And yeah, so throughout this talk, I'm going to show you mainly just the email here, and then also a little screenshot of the preview pane, because both of them are important when you're constructing a phishing email. So anti-phishing policies, this is a big one. So you got spoofing detection, impersonation protection, mailbox intelligence, safety tips, and phishing thresholds. And I'll go through each one really quickly, but yeah, there's a lot to cover under this. So spoofing detection, that also known as spoof intelligence. It's basically reporting on sender and domain spoofing attempts. So if you're trying to spoof a specific sender or a specific domain, it will report whether or not it has detected that. And it also provides unauthenticated sender indicators, which I've got a little picture of here. And basically, most commonly, this occurs if you've sent an email and you're going to fail SPF. It will still, in some cases, depending on how you've configured your email, arrive in the inbox of the user, but it will just come in with this unverified sender warning to let the user know, hey, this person is probably not the domain or the person they're saying they are, so just watch out. And again, it'll give it that little unverified tag there. Impersonation protection. So this is a service where you can apply almost like an extra protection to specific email addresses or domains. So it's in, you've got a little configuration panel where you can say, okay, I want this sender within my organization, say a list of executives, to have some extra impersonation checks, or I want everything from my internal domain to go through extra impersonation checks. And if that impersonation is detected, it will apply a specific action similar to DMARC, like do I want it to go to the junk, do I want it to be quarantined or deleted. And then there's mailbox intelligence, which basically it uses AI to detect email patterns, and it'll apply a specific action if it detects an irregular email pattern, so junk, quarantine, delete, similar to the protected addresses and domains. Safety tips. So safety tips are quite common. The most common of those being the first contact safety tip, which occurs when you get basically an email from an irregular sender. But they've also got user impersonation, domain impersonation, and one for unusual characters, which I've never been able to trigger and I don't know how it works. And these are all inserted into the email body. So as you can see here, I'm sure many of you have probably seen that little grey box above an email at some stage. It essentially says, hey, you don't often get email from this sender. So, just a little subtle alert, and it also appears in the little preview pane on the side as the first text that you'll see. And phishing thresholds. So that's on a scale from 1 to 4, 1 being standard, which is the default, and 4 being the most aggressive. As the sensitivity, basically the sensitivity increases as the threshold is raised, and this threshold is based off confidence indicators. So each email that goes into your organization will get its own phishing and spam confidence level score. The phishing ones are scored from 1 to 3 or 4 to 8. So 1 to 3 being a neutral score and 4 to 8 being suspicious. And the spam level confidence score goes from 0 to 9. 0 is low, 9 is high. And so as you up that phishing threshold, those lower scores will get treated as if they were higher scores. So it'll basically be extra scrutiny on each email to make sure that it's not malicious. So an important note before I go any further is all of these protections have a sole focus on analyzing the from header in the from SMTP header, which means that other headers are often overlooked, which is mainly the talk, the whole premise of the talk. It's a bit of foreshadowing there. So keep that in mind. And I'll go into the journey to spoofing. So I set up a little victim organization. I'm going to call it the Tanto Testing Organization, which basically was just a design as proof of concept to show all of these techniques in practice. So there's 2 employees. You got John Doe, which is the victim, and James Bond will be the impersonation target, so the person who we will be impersonating. And I've configured a number of protections. So I've got my native external tagging, first contact safety tip, impersonation and spoofing protection, and I've set the phishing threshold to the most aggressive setting. On the attacking side, I'll be sending from the tantomail.com domain, which is essentially a domain that I set up with SPF and DMARC records pointing to my IPs to make sure that I'm going to pass those checks and not get sent to junk. So the idea is that this was designed as an overkill environment to be like a bit of a proof of concept, like if you can get a good phishing email here, you can get a good phishing email anywhere. So a current state of what our emails might look like now, there's a number of things we're going to have to deal with. So external tags, those safety tip warnings, and plain email addresses, which I'll show you in a second. So the first thing I really want to look into is most common in emails. All emails now have a display name when you're sending the email, so it's not just the address that shows up, it's like a little name rather than I'm just john@outlook.com, I'm actually John Smith, and then in little brackets it'll have john@outlook.com. So I figured, okay, let's start with that. Let's try and add a display name. However, so this is what it looks like without a display name. So you got james.bond@tantomail.com, and you can see we're getting that, the external tag, we're getting the first contact safety tip. So I added a display name, and interestingly I noticed it went to junk. And I first was confused as why that might be. And then I realized I did configure James Bond as a protected sender. So what was happening was Outlook was looking at the display name James Bond and saying, look, this is very similar to the legitimate James Bond. This is probably an impersonation attempt. So it would send it to the junk, which is what I had configured. Now it also added that impersonation safety tip. So this person appears to be someone similar who previously sent you an email but may not be that person. And yeah, sent to junk, which is not what we want. So I decided to, see if we could maybe do a little bit better. So going into the RFC, based on that sole focus of analyzing the from header, I wanted to look at what other origination headers might be available. So when I was looking at that, I discovered the sender header, which is not a secret header at all, by the way, if you haven't heard of it. It's described as the mailbox of the agent responsible for the transmission of the message, which is quite a mouthful. But in order to explain it probably best, the RFC does provide a little nice diagram. So say we've got John Doe, who might be an executive, and Michael Jones, who might be John's secretary. And so John writes a message, but he doesn't actually want to send that email himself because he's got a secretary to do that for him. So he writes up the message, and then he passes it on to Michael, and Michael sends it on his behalf to Mary. And so then Michael would be the mailbox responsible for the transmission of the message, but John was the actual original author of the message. So that's probably the best way to explain it. So this sender header, when you include it in your emails, it actually does change the format of what it looks like from a recipient's point of view. So your email will arrive, and it'll come up as sender on behalf of the from. So what I mean by that is it'll show as, okay, James Bond at legit.com on behalf of james.bond@tantomail.com, our actual sender. And interestingly, there's no validation here of the display name or the domain. So I don't own @legit.com. I just included that, and there's nothing, it just works. And interestingly, as I said, I can put that display name back, and there's nothing stopping me from including it. It's not going to junk or anything like that. So the first thing I thought about, okay, well, if there's no validation, what happens if I include an internal domain? Like, does that raise any alarm bells? No, it turns out. So this was kind of my first little step around. I found a little bypass for that external tagging. So by including that sender header with the internal domain, the external tag isn't applied. So as you can see in the bottom right, we've dropped that external tag, and it's no longer got that warning message in the email body either. And so it can look a bit more like the email was sent internally because it doesn't have an external tag. And even interestingly, if you hover over the sender header, if you set it to a person who exists within that organization, so James Bond in this case, it actually brings up their profile when you hover over it, so adds even a little bit more legitimacy. However, I've still got safety tips in the email, so that's not ideal. So I wanted to look into that. Maybe I could get around that. So I decided to analyze the safety tips. So I dive straight into the email source. So if you didn't know, like email, if you especially in Outlook, you can like click on a little menu and you can download the email source or view the email source, and it'll show you all the SMTP headers and the actual content of the message. So I did this, and what I noticed, this is the message content here, is that the safety tip, when it's inserted, it's prepended to the top of the message body in a table, and our content that they might include is inserted in a div underneath. So you can see like we've got this table here, and it'll give you the message. You don't often get email from james.bonded@tantomail.com. And then I've got my actual message, hello John, can you send me the company card so I can renew our contracts for this year? So the user is always going to see that warning first, and that's always going to be used for the preview of the message, which isn't ideal. So my first idea was, can we control the safety tip with CSS? So considering it is in the email body and we have control of the email body, what if we just include some style tags to hide this tip? So it was like, okay, the TR element, so I'll go back. The TR element here doesn't have any style attached to it, so that was initially I was like, okay, what if I added my own style tag inline to apply, display none, as I've set here. So I'd add that to the top of my message body, and my question was, does that prevent the warning from rendering? Well, initially yes, but now no. So silently this was fixed as I was making these slides, and it was a fantastic fix from Microsoft, I'd probably make it look like this. So, it wasn't displaying correctly in CSS. What does Microsoft do? Well, they just slap an important tag on there, and I'll let us all kind of appreciate the inline CSS in which Microsoft wrote. If you try and insert and change the style, they've just said, oh, well, what if we just include every CSS tag with important so that it's impossible for you to change it, which is quite amusing. So what did they do? They added revert important to every style inline, which, if you didn't know, basically will set the style of that element back to the original intended style with the highest priority. So revert reverts it back. Important means that it will override everything, and because it's included inline, it's like the top level. Can't be overridden, at least not that I know of. So now I was like, okay, now I'm going to find a way around it because we're not going to let that stop us. So I became interested in end-to-end encryption within emails. So I thought, okay, well, what about those encrypted emails? Like, if the safety tip is being inserted into the email body, what if we encrypted our email body? Would that still insert these safety tips in there? How are they handled? Do they show up differently? So looking into it, there's basically two main types. You've got PGP and SMIME. I'm going to focus on PGP because it's the easiest to implement, doesn't require certificates, setting those up and configuring them in different email clients. That's where I started. So PGP, based on public key cryptography. There's two methods, again, for how to use PGP in emails. The original old method is called inline PGP, which is basically where the encrypted email is included directly in the message body under like a plain text content type, and then interpreted by the email client at the other end. The new way that it's done now is with multi-part MIME messages. So now you'll have like different content types. You have your encrypted part, which will contain your encrypted message, and maybe you'll have your signature as well. So now it kind of abstracts it away from the user a little more. So I decided I'm going to focus on inline. That's really easy, and I don't have to worry about trying to emulate all this fancy multi-part messages. I can just do it inline. So yeah, here's a little quick diagram of what inline PGP looks like. So you'll have your SMTP headers, then you'll have a little gap. Then when you have your message content, it starts with this begin PGP message indicator. You put your content in there, and then you have your end PGP message, and then terminate it with a full stop like you do all other messages. So my idea was there's actually no requirement that the content for PGP messages to be encrypted, as the text in the content will render as per the content type header. So if I specify plain text in content type, and then I put my PGP indicators, begin PGP message, end PGP message, I can put anything in between those, and the email's still going to send because it's still plain text content. So my thought was, okay, what if I send an unencrypted message inside those PGP indicators? How does the mail client process that email? If it's looking for those indicators, what happens? Does it change the way the email is displayed? Does it change the way it's processed? So I decided to have a look into that, and I found a little thing. So I found that adding that PGP syntax does actually remove the safety tips. So they're not only hidden, they're never inserted into the email in the first place. So it appears that when you send emails with this begin PGP message, Outlook looks through the email, finds that, and goes, okay, it's encrypted, we're not going to worry about it, it's fine. And they just ignore it entirely. And also, these can be placed anywhere in the email. So you could have your begin PGP message at the very bottom of the email, and as long as it's in there, it'll still work. And it also works with an HTML content type. So it means that you can actually put your begin PGP message inside an HTML comment, and it means that it's never displayed to the user and it's completely removed from the email, and they have no idea what's going on. So this is just an example of me including the begin PGP message just as text, and as you can see, the first contact safety tip is no longer inserted, and it's no longer overriding the message preview in that preview pane. So if I include begin PGP message inside a HTML comment, it will show the hello John as the first text in the email in the preview, rather than having that warning text be the first text in the preview. So, as a bit of a review of where we are now, we're now able to hide those the external tagging and the safety tips. However, the attacker's domain is still visible in the email preview. So we've still got the attacker's domain visible at the end, and we've also got this weird syntax, sender on behalf of the from. So, you know, you've got your spoof sender in there, James Bond, but it's weird being James Bond on behalf of James Bond. Like, if people are looking at that, they're probably going to think something weird's going on. There's no profile picture as well. I'd really love James's profile picture. That would add a extra level of legitimacy. And in the preview pane as well, it still only shows the email of the attacker. That's most key. It still shows the attacker's email, so there's still a problem there. So I decided to dive a little bit into the syntax of from headers. So I looked into, I found a talk from Black Hat USA. It's a really good talk called You Have No Idea Who Sent That Email, 18 Attacks on Email Sender Authentication. Really good comprehensive talk which presents a number of different novel techniques for spoofing emails. But the gist of that talk is every mail user agent has its own parser, and these parsers are rarely compliant with the RFC that the from header was devised for. And so this leads to complex from header syntax and every mail client having a different interpretation of the real address that it was sent from, and which will lead to something I like to call from header confusion. So as a bit of an example, this here is a legitimate from header. So you can have display name, comments, a route portion, and then your address, and the mail user agent has to look through that and pick the address as the correct section of the email and go, yep, that's who sent the email. And you'll find a lot of times this isn't the case, and sometimes you can get away with some interesting stuff. So from header confusion, I'll expand on that a little bit more, but basically it's when mail clients disagree on the real address of the sender, and it's exploiting those inconsistencies in message passing. And it's really powerful between two different mail user agents. So if you're going to send between Gmail and Outlook, you might exploit sending an email from Gmail and it arriving in Outlook to exploit these inconsistencies. And this will be the example that I'll quickly run through. So we'll devise a message as follows. So we've got our hello from Gmail. Our mail from is from attacker@gmail.com. Recipient will be john@outlook.com. And we start our from header, and we're going to include two addresses in there. So our from header will be start with spoofed@gmail.com, then attacker@gmail.com. And your to header again to John, subject hello, and with a little message of hello John. Now, when Gmail looks at this, it's going to look and verify the last address here matches the mail from, which it does, and it's also going to verify that we are attacker@gmail.com and that we own that Gmail account, and we're not just, you know, making it up that that's us, and you know it's all fine. So Gmail will look at that and it will go, yep, those match. You own attacker@gmail.com. You can send this message. Now, when it arrives in Outlook, Outlook will look at the first email included in the from header. Here's where the problems begin. So Outlook will look at that and go, okay, I can verify through DMARC that gmail.com and the mail from and the from header match. So Outlook will look at those and go, yep, they're both from gmail.com, nothing to worry about there. And Outlook obviously can't verify the user portion because it has no access to knowing whether or not you are attacker@gmail.com or whether you are spoofed@gmail.com. So Outlook doesn't care about that. It only cares about the domain, and so as long as that domain matches up, it's all fine. So this email will then successfully arrive in your Outlook email inbox. So as I've said here, The result of that is spoofing Gmail addresses to an Outlook inbox. And this is not just limited to Outlook and Gmail. This is any two mail agents which might have different interpretations on which section is actually the from address. So that's a key thing to note. Like, it's not just Outlook and Gmail, it can be really any. And this will also pass verification checks because we're not spoofing a domain, we're sending from gmail.com, which anyone can do. So as I've said here, we get the authentication results. We're going to pass SPF and we're going to pass DMARC. There's nothing wrong with that. And you'll get an email here which arrives and looks like this. Now it's going to show these warning messages because I haven't hidden them. But the point is we can send now from spoofed@gmail.com from the Gmail address to an Outlook inbox. We have no control. We don't have no control over this spoofed user. This can be anyone, and Outlook will receive and go, yeah, that's all fine. Nothing wrong with that. So I decided, okay, this is an interesting concept, and I wanted to take it a little bit further to see if it was possible to use any domain, because that's the real crux of it. That's the cream of the crop, spoofing from any domain. So I decided to look into the allowed characters you can include in headers. So there's a number of different syntax options here. Although email addresses are often included inside carets, they can be comma separated to separate multiple addresses, and they're always in the form of user@domain. Email or mailing groups can be defined with a colon. Display names can be included inside quotes. And mainly, initially in the original spec, it's only ASCII characters. This was extended upon in RFC 1342. However, I decided for this, I'm just going to focus on ASCII characters, and if I need to, I'll then expand out to non-ASCII characters. So I've got a little list on the side here, which is from the RFC, which kind of describes these different characters, as I've talked about. So empty addresses was an interesting thing which I decided to kind of experiment with. So what is an empty address? Well, an empty address was including an empty address before the real address in the from header. So an example I've got here is you just include those two carets with a comma in the middle, and you put that before the from address, and that will be an empty address with no actual email in there. Now, when you send an empty address in the email, it will arrive and it will hide the address from view of the recipient. So as you can see, I've sent from test with the empty address, then james.bond@tantomail.com. And when it arrives, the user can only see test there. They can't see the actual address it's come from. A couple of interesting things I noted. A display name must be present in this. So if you don't include a display name, it will fail and go to junk. And also, if you have to include a comma in between the carets, if you don't, it will fail and go to junk. And what I suspect might be the case is potentially someone had reported something similar in the past and gone, hey, I can put this two carets and, I can hide the address. And Microsoft went, okay, let's just prevent people from doing that. And so there has to be something in between the two carets. And so if you put a comma in there, it still works. So it's kind of interesting. So the next thing I wanted to look into, now that I've got that empty address funkiness, I decided, okay, if I have to put a display name, maybe I can find a way to put a display name which isn't rendered by the client. So I looked into ASCII control characters, which are, if you don't know, are the first 32 characters of the ASCII table. And these are accepted as valid in SMTP headers because they're ASCII characters. So what I've decided to do is, okay, let's send one of these control characters, so in this case \x1f, let's put it in the middle of the display name, and I'll see whether or not it actually renders on the client. So I sent this off, and as you can see when it arrives and it looks as if it's just from test james.bond@tantomail.com, and there's no indication to the user that a hex character was ever inserted or was ever present in the email. Now it's important to note, like, not all characters will display this way. I tested basically all 32 of these characters and found that \X1F isn't rendered on both the web and desktop clients. Some of the characters will render as that rectangular box, and some of them will be hidden. You just kind of have to play around with an experiment. So now that I had those two techniques, the empty addresses and hiding the display name, I decided to put them together. So I thought, okay, well, let's put the empty address in, let's put just this one control character, and what's going to happen to the email? Now, if it's meant to be only displaying the display name due to the empty address, if it's going to hide that real address, and there's nothing to display because it's a hex character, what's Outlook actually going to show? So I combined the addresses, I combined the techniques. So in the from header, I put the empty address and I put the hex character, and I included the sender address as mentioned before with my spoofed user, and I sent it off to see what would happen. Lo and behold, it actually renders the sender address as the address in which the email was sent from, and includes a profile picture of James Bond, which I was originally very surprised with at first. I was very happy with the finding, and I thought it was very interesting. But yeah, as you can see, we've dropped that external tag, we've dropped the first contact safety tip, we've dropped the weird funky syntax. It now only shows this was from James Bond, here's his profile, and this is the email he sent you. So it's important to note as well, I did some testing with some third-party email security products, and during my testing, none of these products actually picked up on this technique, so they all arrived through just fine. Kind of been trying to work with some of the vendors to get that fixed. We'll see how that goes. But for now, yeah, it's not picked up. So a little demo. I do have a pre-recorded demo because I didn't want to spin the live demo roulette. I just hope that it's going to work, the pre-recorded one. Okay, there's no sound. Okay, cool. So it might be a bit small, but essentially on the left here I've got a script which is basically sending those email headers. So you've got hello, command, mail from, recipient to, then your content, and it's got the SMTP headers there, and it's got the SMTP message body afterwards. I'm including the begin PGP message in an HTML content. I'm including the empty address and the hex characters, and I'm including the sender address. So I'll send that off to our victim, John Doe. It takes a little second here, and then you'll see on the right, it arrives in John Doe's inbox. So James Bond with his profile there, and James can click on this email, and it shows up here, James Bond with his profile, the message there, and there's really no indication from his point of view that this was not from James Bond. He would have to look through the message headers of an email to realize that this wasn't from James Bond. So a couple of extra tricks which I think we have some time for. So fake recipients. So as I've mentioned before, those SMTP commands are what's used to route the email and determine who receives it. So you can exploit this as only addresses in the recipient to actually receive the email. So it allows you to create some fake recipients by only including those addresses in the to header. Now this sort of behavior is quite useful if you want to almost apply a bit of peer pressure to an individual. So if you wanted to include a number of different addresses, especially higher ups in a specific email, and you didn't want them to actually receive the email, but you wanted to make the recipient believe they did. Or you can use it for individual tracking links. So if you wanted to send a group email to a number of recipients, but you wanted an individual link for each person in that group, you can use fake recipients to actually send an individual email to each recipient, but make it look like from their perspective that only one email was ever sent. So what this might look like is I've got Jane Smith in here. Jane Smith never actually received the email, but you can see she's in the to header. You can hover over her, it brings up her profile. So from James's point of view, from John's point of view, there's no indication that she never received the email. Mail flow rules, as I talked about earlier, so these can be hidden as well. If they're inserted into the email body, you can hide them with CSS. Interestingly, the first contact safety tip thing, hiding with CSS was patched, but doing the same thing with mail flow rules wasn't. So you can hide it with this hashtag footer display none. And you can also change the, if it's inserted into the subject, you can actually change the preview text on some clients as well by including an input of type image with alt text, which sometimes is inserted before the mail flow rule preview text. Redirecting replies as well. So there's another SMTP header called reply to, which can be used to redirect email replies. So this can be used to ensure that targets don't actually alert your impersonation victim. If you don't include this, what can often happen and what I've experienced is the emails are so legitimate that people start reaching out to the actual person saying, I can't make this meeting, and then this person's like, what meeting? I never organized the meeting. And so if you want to try and avoid that, you can include this reply to header to prevent them from being alerted unless they're sent a direct email. And again, it can be useful if you're redirecting to an attacker-controlled address. It can be useful to track which recipients might have responded to a phishing email. So if you wanted that kind of reporting in there as well, you can. Meeting invites. This is almost another talk in of itself because it's very complicated. Lots of different syntax you can have in there. It's simple at heart, but there's a lot of potential with it. But essentially, each meeting invite, which is very common nowadays, is just an ICS file with a special content type. And each ICS file also has a whole range of fields with its own RFC of what you can do with it. But the same techniques can apply to these meeting invites, just different fields to look at. So you've got attendees and organizers. So by setting RSVP false to attendees, it means that if they're accepting a meeting, the notification emails won't go to the organizer, similar as the redirecting replies. And if you wanted to include HTML content, you can use the X-alt description to set that content, which also conveniently bypasses safety tips and mail flow rules as a feature. Like they're just not inserted into the text in the meeting invite, which is interesting. But yeah, these are very common Microsoft Teams meeting, and you can use this same spoofing. As you can see, I've spoofed the organizer as James Bond, and one of the attendees is John Doe. And if John RSVPs to this meeting, it won't automatically send James an invite saying that John accepted a meeting that he never organized. So, now probably my favorite one, which is a bit of a fun one, is the anonymous sender. So in this whole thing where Outlook's failing to pass that from header, it doesn't know what to show the user, so it shows the sender header. What happens if you don't give it that option of the sender header? You include those hex characters and the empty address, but you don't give it that extra fallback option. Well, it means that Outlook's unable to render any sender information and the email displays as unknown, which does create some interesting opportunities for a bit of fun. So it's the perfect platform to insert your favorite saw quote or taken speech and send an email off to someone. Hello, John, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. And you can freak him out a little bit because John has no idea who it came from. So as a bit of a wrap up, disclosure. So I reported this to Microsoft, and they recently got back to me and basically said that this case doesn't meet MSRC's current bar for immediate servicing. So I guess they're not going to do anything with it, but maybe they'll have another opinion after this talk. We'll see. But I don't know, see what happens. Looking forward, so what's quite clear, and many people have said the same thing, is that SMTP is a problem because security wasn't designed in there by default, and also this inconsistent SMTP parsing is going to be an ongoing problem since no vendors seem to be able to follow the RFC, and they just kind of like, I'll do what I want. Future research, again, you can look into other email providers. I'm sure you'll find something pretty similar. Google, Apple, Yahoo as some examples, Proton Mail as well. And each of these email providers, there's also your own like user agent. So for example, you could be using Gmail for your email services, but then you might be using, say, if you're on Linux, you might be using Thunderbird as your mail client. So there's two potentials there for looking at Gmail and then also looking at Thunderbird, because each of those are going to have their own idea of who's the email actually sent from. And then there's also probably some extra research of bypassing link and attachment scanning. So one thing that you'd want to do often with phishing emails is send some malicious links or send some malicious attachments. And so it'd be really handy if you found a way to bypass that sort of scanning. And so that might be something I'll look into in the future. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening.
Do we have any questions in the audience? Sending one of our runners out to answer that question. Or take the question.
Okay, there's a few.
Hey there. Great presentation. Really interested in the reply to aspect of that. I know you can set the reply to field so that it goes in the right direction. What cosmetically does it look like? Does that give a clue to the target that there might be something funky going on? Or does Outlook magically make the cosmetic stuff beautiful for you?
It's probably something that I should look into a little bit more. If you just basically include another address in the reply to, if the address is outside the victim organization, then it will alert that person that that email is going to go to someone outside the organization. In practice, I've found that a lot of people just don't realize that. So I've been able to, in a number of engagements, include that reply to header and get emails back, and people don't usually realize that it's going somewhere else, or even they might realize, oh, it's not going to this person. I might as well include their actual email as well, and include my attacking email and the person's real email, and not even realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't be sending this email somewhere off, something weird. But yeah, at the moment it shows up as external, but potentially you could maybe come up with some way to send it off and not have it as external. Would be really interesting.
Do we have any more questions in the audience?
Yep, another question here. So two-part question. I was wondering, how long have you been doing this research for? Like, that was an absolute ton of work. It was really great. And second part, did you find any differences between parsing on mobile and desktop?
Yeah, there is some differences. So to answer your first question, that was kind of a couple of months of work. It really spanned off. I did a phishing engagement for a client, and then I began looking at what the possibilities were, and I looked and dived deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, and there's a lot that isn't in this presentation that was just failed things that didn't work. Between desktop and web, there are a couple of differences. So the easiest one to talk about would be, say, those hex characters. So web and desktop sometimes have different opinions on whether they will show the hex character, whether they'll show a little rectangle box. Between web and desktop, usually in Outlook at least, the parsing of the from header seems to be the same. So Outlook, web and desktop will both agree on who to show the from header for. But there are some other inconsistencies around, including, say, when I talked about the the mail flow rules, like if I can maybe go back, I don't know, we'll see. So mail flow rules. So one thing I've noted is if you've got mail flow rules and you're in, say, Outlook desktop, including this input at the bottom with a type of image and alt text will hide the preview text, but in the Outlook web it actually doesn't work. It actually, I think, sometimes will render that preview text instead of hiding it. So there are some slight inconsistencies. Most of the time it seems pretty similar though. So yeah.
You have a question over here as well?
Yeah, awesome. That was really cool, by the way. Did you try to use any like lookalike characters, like Cyrillic characters, to bypass the impersonation tags?
Yeah, that would have been something like that I'm really interested in, including potentially some Unicode characters, especially as, say, I know some vendors or some email security vendors are trying to come up with patches for this stuff, and so they've started to look at the sender header and look for a domain that might match the client's or victim's domain. So that could be a potential for lookalike characters to be inserted so that the domain will still look like the victim domain but not actually be the victim domain. So there's definitely some potential for a bit of research in that area as well.
So with the Unicode characters that you put in the sender, is there anything that the gateway products can detect, like Mimecast or Defender?
Well, I guess Unicode characters, I mean, you could probably say that most of emails, if we're going off like what's a legitimate email, most email addresses aren't going to include Unicode characters. So from my perspective, I could see that if a Unicode character was found inside an address, that it should be marked as suspicious at the very least, since I can't really see any legitimate use case for it. Yeah, that would be my, my thinking.
Do we have any last questions in the audience?
Hey, for your test case where you impersonated James Bond, I was just wondering, so is this impersonating someone who's outside the organization, like your organization that you set up, and the sender of that spoof email, he would need to have the access to that actual domain, right? Like it would have to be, like the sender IP address still has to correspond to the sender header that you spoofed.
So when I'm doing my impersonation, the from domain is the part that I need to control. So the tantomail.com domain is one that I own, that I have records set up for. Anything in the sender header is basically, as Microsoft views it, anything goes. You can put any domain or any user in there and there's no extra checks or verifications there. In these attacks, James Bond is an actual employee or I guess user within the client tenant that I set up. So there's John Doe as our victim, James Bond as another user who I was impersonating. So I don't need to have access to anything that James has. I can just include his email there, spoof him in the sender header, and as long as I've got a domain that I own within the from header that matches what I've put in the mail from command, then it's all fine.
We'll have to stop questions there. Hit up Ben outside, but let's thank Ben one more time for a great talk.